Fantastic. So on to our first presentation of the day. We're talking about Julia Child's double life from spy to chef, a Hellenistic chart analysis, and introducing our fantastic speakers. First, we have Amy Angelo. Amy is a professional astrologer living in New York City. She holds a certification from Demetra George in Hellenistic astrology, a rigorous 3-year curriculum that explores ancient perspectives on planetary condition, the houses, and timing techniques. She is currently a graduate student at Teachers College at Columbia University studying spiritual psychology. And you can find Amy's website at amyangelo.com. And Amy is also on Instagram and TikTok, as you can see on the screen there. Next, we have Nadia Anderson. Nadia is a Hellenistic astrologer, researcher, and educator at KeplerCollege. With a background in Greek classics, philosophy, and traditional astrology, her work focuses on reviving and contextualizing ancient celestial knowledge. She holds a BA in Greek classics from the University of Oregon and a Master's of Humanities from New York University, where she focused on comparative literature and philosophy. She trained in Hellenistic astrology under Demetra George, earning a certification in Hellenistic astrology after completing a rigorous 3-year program on planetary condition, the houses, and timing techniques. Nadia is currently studying primary directions with Martin Gaston and traditional natal astrology with Ben Dykes. Beyond astrology, Nadia is also a filmmaker and art director, captivated by how stories shape our understanding of time and fate. And you can go to Nadia's website, which is thewanderstars.com, and you can also find Nadia on Instagram. Next, we have Joey Cannizzaro. Across disciplines and forms of media, Joey Cannizzaro, they, them, she, her, works with metaphysics to cultivate radically different ways of thinking and being. Joey's astrology practice is orientated towards both nurturing personal liberation and provoking societal transformation, weaving together Hellenistic techniques and ancient cosmology with threads of anarchism, mysticism, crypt theory, and queerness. They hold a certification in Hellenistic astrology from Demetra George, a bachelor's degree from the New School, and an MFA in writing and integrated media from California Institute of the Arts. And you can find the website chronosandchaos.com. I love that name. And you can also find more information on Instagram and Twitter. And our last speaker today, and unfortunately, Brian could not be here, but we'll be playing his recording. Brian is a consulting astrologer based in Salt Lake City, Utah. He earned his Bachelor of Arts from Marquette University, where he studied anthropology and psychology. Brian has completed the astrologer training program with Kelly Surtees. After completing the Horary practitioner course at the School of Traditional Astrology, he's enrolled in the diploma program. Additionally, he is studying Hellenistic astrology under Chris Brennan and has completed Demetra George's Hellenistic retreats. In 2024, he presented his work at the Time Lords Summit in Olympia, Washington, titled Hellenistic Time Lords and the Diary of Anne Frank. Brian specializes in natal and horary astrology and co-hosts the Ninth House podcast. He enjoys baking sourdough bread, hiking, and cross-training in his free time. And Brian's website is brianforman.com, and his social media handle is Brian Forman. So thank you all for joining us today. This is going to be a long day, so if you can't stay for the whole period, you'll watch the replays. You can watch our replays on our YouTube channel. And with that, Amy, I'm going to pass on the baton to you. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Callum, and everyone from Kepler College. We're so excited to be here today. We're thrilled to be here for Astrology Day, and we will kick off the event by talking about Julia Child's double life. And so my name is Amy Angelo. I will introduce Julia, talk about the Thema Mundi and Sect theory, really setting the stage for the planetary story. Joey Cannizzaro will cover the operation of overcoming as an aspect in the birth chart. Nadia is going to take us through a thrilling journey on circumambulations of the bounds, and Brian Forman will guide us through timing techniques and consulting strategies through the Hellenistic framework. And so who is Julia Child? For those who do not know, she is a famous author and chef TV personality who really popularized French cooking to an American audience. She's most famous for her book, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, and her show, The French Chef. And so we chose Julia Child strategically and specifically because she is someone who came into her fame later in life. She lived a very full and rich and accomplished life, and her birth chart has proved to be a very fascinating study. So we're going to cover these different time periods where maybe you did not know she was a wartime spy during World War II. She married the love of her life, Paul Child, lived in France, attended the Cordon Bleu, which is a very famous cooking school, wrote her book, which was a 10-year endeavor, published the book, goes on TV, becomes American, super famous American TV personality, and becomes highly awarded. And so she is this incredible living example of American TV royalty. And so I want to talk about today how early in my Hellenistic astrology studies, I became quite overwhelmed by the pure abundance of information and figuring out where to start. So I hope that today my presentation will give a framework of where to start with the birth chart, to start to suss out the planetary story and to see how the birth chart comes alive as a living system. And so no planet exists alone. Multiple planets contribute to the movements and the conversations that are happening with the chart. And so we're going to talk about where to begin and kind of set some of the foundational principles of the planetary story. So I want to start with the Thema Mundi. This is the mythical birth chart of the world, and it's a living artifact that connects us to the wisdom of astrology's ancient past. And so in it, we can see the principles of sect, rulership, aspect theory, and so much more begin to come to unfold. And so what's really fascinating about Julia Child specifically is that her nativity includes 3 natal planets that are reflected in the Thema Mundi. This really enhances the power and potency of her nativity. She has Mercury in Virgo, she has her sun in Leo, and she has Jupiter in Sagittarius. And so Firmicus Maternus writes that he who has 3 stars put in their own domiciles will be lucky and powerful beyond measure. And that proved to be true for Julia Child in her life. So I want to start by kind of setting the foundation and talking about sect. Why is sect important and how can it begin to give us information about a nativity, a birth chart? And so sect determines how much freedom and authority that a planet has to bring forth its agenda and positive significations. It speaks to the teammates that planets can rely on to see who's the most supportive and the most challenging and biggest challenger to their agenda. And it helps us to identify the general style and the energetic quality of the nativity as well. So in the life of Julia Child, she is a nocturnal nativity. We'll see her birth chart very shortly. She was born at night. So the moon is her sect light, and she relies on Venus, Mars, and Mercury as her sect mates. And the most challenging planet in her nativity is Saturn. And so we will unpack this together. And so here's the wonderful birth chart of Julia Child. Like I said, she was born at night, and her sect light is the moon. And so the moon represents being, reflecting, nourishing. It's a planet of the public. And I want to highlight the kind of quality of Julia Child's chart through her nocturnal nativity. So from Demetra George's book, Volume 1, she talks about how nocturnal individuals belong to a lunar school of thought where the moon is representing the body and the physical senses become a very heightened experience for nocturnal birth charts. And so they can rely on a subjective state of awareness, relying on instinct and understanding some of the depths of causes. And so this is a quality that emerges. And one thing I would like to say is you might look at this birth chart and the sun in Leo might really take the center stage, but we're actually not going there. We're going to just kind of like talk about her sect light, the moon, which might be a little bit of an unusual approach considering the sun in Leo likes to be acknowledged and worked with. So Julia Child was quite a night owl. She was a night chart, she was a night owl, and this speaks to her having most of her energy under moonlight or in the darkness. And so in her memoir, she actually writes that her and her partner Paul often dined late and worked into the early hours when they were working on the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking. And so they would have dinner late, they would work late, and then as soon as the sun started coming up, they would go to sleep. And so she did have this revitalized energy under the moon. And this could be a quality that you see with night chart nativities, where their energy is when the sun is down below and the moon is the luminary that's shining the our world at night. And so just a little bit about her moon. It is in Libra in the domicile of Venus, and it's an aversion to its ruler. Venus is in fall. And according to Rhetorius, when the moon is an aversion to a planet, it suggests some kind of ineffectiveness, separation, or difficulty in relation to what the planet represents. And so we can see that the ruler of the moon is fallen. And so it might engage in some challenges. It might have some challenges to fulfill its agenda. And the moon is also co-present with the South Node, which brings an element of instability and urgency, a sense of urgency. And so we see that the moon is located in the fifth house of pleasure, creativity, sensuality, fun, and children. And it's ruling over the second house of money, income, and resources. So Julia's finances were driven by her creative pursuits. But what's really interesting is that she really did want to have children, but she never could have children. And so a lot of her creative energy went into her cooking and her creativity through this outlet, through the body and through the senses and through being a chef. And so now we're moving on to her chart ruler, Mercury. This is like such a strong Mercury. I just have to say, it's extremely potent. It's its own domicile lord, it's its own bound lord, and it's its own exaltation lord. So it is operating at a high volatility, high capacity, and with all cylinders firing. And it speaks to, having this exalted chart ruler speaks to being a person or being seen as a high value, having authority and gaining respect. And so Mercury is retrograde. We can see that in the chart. And I should just say that Mercury represents intelligence, practical wisdom, education, learning, writing, and communication. So we would expect these topics to be amplified in her life. And there are some challenges here. We have a Mercury that is retrograde, which can speak to delays or reversals. And it also does have a condition of maltreatment from an overcoming superior square from Saturn, which Joey will talk about in a beautiful way. And so it has a little bit of protection because with the condition of bonification by being within 3 degrees of the sect of the chart, Venus, the benefic of the sect of the chart. And so Mercury is located in a strong angular fourth house of home, family, roots, traditions, and it's ruling over the first house of her character, her vitality, and her body. And so how we see this occur in Julia's life is that Julia's name and likeness was featured in over 1.5 million American homes through her words and wisdom of her cookbook. That's only in her lifetime. And now that is even more because her book continues to be such a classic. And so she was a spy. And so I want to kind of talk about that a little bit. So she was actually rejected by the Army and Navy for being too tall. And she worked in a newly found unit during World War II that was the predecessor to the CIA called the OSS. And so she got rejected from being in the military and like in a physical way, but her intellect was seen and shown in this role. And so she was working as an assistant, typing up thousands of names on white note cards, and she had top security clearances, knowing everything coming in and out that are coming through her office. And so she worked very closely. Her first famous recipe was that she actually developed shark repellent with this organization, with this secret organization, the Secret Intelligence Division. And there's a quote from Firmicus Maternus where he says that if Mercury were found as an evening star in the fourth place, like we see here with Julia's chart, from the hour marker, they will be masters of certain hidden arts or who seem to be instructed in computation or calculation. And it will make leaders of people in charge of gymnastics. And so she was working in this very highly secretive environment and thriving intellectually. Um, and this is kind of the beginning of seeing a really potent Mercury, which then evolved later into writing her master work. And so she spent nearly a decade perfecting the mastering the art of French cooking. This woman rigorously tested recipes. And at a certain point, the manuscript was so huge that she had to fully restructure it. And ultimately, it became a classic that was praised for its clarity and engaging instructional voice. And so we talked about how Mercury is its own domicile lord, bound lord, and exaltation lord. And there's actually a quote here from Firmicus that speaks to this potency. And he says that if Mercury were the lord of the nativity, and it will make clever, ingenious people learning everything, modest, desiring to learn the secrets of all arts. And if he were found in his own house, when he is allotted the rulership of the nativity, or in his own bounds and heights, all of these, it will make poets, orators adorned with overflowing graceful speech. And she has one of the most iconic voices. Her show, she was beloved. And people can probably recognize her voice if you know who she is, just with your eyes closed and not even seeing her. And this is a picture of her cookbook. I mean, there were imagery and visuals, and every single step was marked in her cookbooks. And last but not least, we want to talk about Saturn. Saturn is positioned to be the most challenging planet in the chart. Saturn represents sorrows, depressions, isolation, constriction, limitations, aging, authority, discipline, hard work, all the Saturnian qualities. And it's really interesting for her because Saturn is positioned to be the most challenging planet in her nativity. As a night chart, Saturn's the greater malefic, but we can also paradoxically see that it's one of the best positioned planets, being in the first house and within 5 degrees rising on the ascendant. And so it also has a close opposition from Jupiter, which enhances its beneficence. So Saturn's rulership, it has multiple layers of rulership from Mercury, domicile bound, and it can speak to having Saturn so close on the ascendant can kind of speak to some of the delays that it took for her to become who she was, her authority and gaining recognition, and maybe facing some criticism or some blocks or obstacles along the way. And so Saturn is in the strong angular first house of character, vitality, and body. It's ruling over the 8th house of inheritance, partners, money, anxiety, and death, and the 9th house of foreign places and foreign travel. And so Julia lived abroad and depended on her partner's salary, both conditions of which were temporary and not long-lasting circumstances. Eventually, Paul Child left his job in the government to support her career, and they had to leave France and move back to America when he lost his job. So she was, the ancients really speak about when you have Saturn in the first house close to the ascendant, that you're the firstborn child in the family, which is actually true for Julia. And so she had a level of responsibility to the family that she inherited through her birth. And it took her some time to become a lasting authority to the public. And so through her life, she did face several health challenges, such as fertility issues, cancer, and knee problems. And she did have her fair share of challenges. So by night, we can see that Rhetorius talks about how Saturn at night brings about damages and opposition and hardships, which she did encounter that my peers and colleagues are going to talk about in more depth. So thank you so much. I hope this sets the stage for the planetary story. This is what we will be covering in the class, developing an understanding of being able to tell the planetary story through planetary condition. We're going to really look at the class through the lens of the Thema Mundi and what the Thema Mundi has to say about all of these things. So I'm so excited to teach this class, and I can't wait to see you there. And now I will I will hand over the times to Joey.
I'm the Time Lord now. Thank you, Amy. I really appreciate the whole setup. Thank you, everybody who made this event happen today. So much work went into making this awesome marathon of astrology together happen. So thank you all. Okay, cool. So my little piece of the panel is going to be talking about Julia Child overcoming Titans. Really one Titan, Saturn, but we'll get more into that. Overcoming is the easiest way that I could just tell you what I'm talking about when I say overcoming is that any two planets that have an aspect, one of the planets is overcoming the other planet. And so, thank you. So, what it means for it to overcome it is that essentially it is the planet that's able to exert its energy, its significations, and its influence over that other planet. And so this was one of the reasons that I really wanted to talk about overcoming specifically today, was because it's like a piece that I felt was missing when I was studying. Like I kept sort of asking myself, like, does it just mix the energy of the planets essentially in aspects, or like when there are mutually exclusive significations? For example, Mercury is the principle of speech, but Saturn is taciturn and not inclined toward speech. So what happens when you combine them, right? And so overcoming is really the key to answering, one of the keys to answering this in ancient astrology. And it felt like a revelation when I figured it out originally. And so, understanding that as the astrological definition, we also use this word regularly, and it means overcoming, coming up from behind, to overtake somebody. And so we also use it really commonly to describe an emotion, like to be overcome by emotion or overcome by intuition, to leave a room, overcome by grief all of a sudden, or really positive, overcome by excitement. And so this is kind of core to the idea too, because if it's malefics who are overcoming, it's like being flooded with those malefic emotions. But if it's benefic, it's the exact opposite. And so even we'll get into this more. But essentially, it really amplifies the energy of whichever planet it is. So overcoming, although it could have a sense of sounding like something bad, like being overtaken by somebody, if it's something benefic, maybe you want to be overcome by that benefic energy. And I think that sort of touches on the last definition of overcoming that I wanted to mention, which is I think it's hard for us to even use the word overcoming without thinking of the American Civil Rights Movement, the song, the anthem, "We Shall Overcome," and the sense that overcoming, of course, this is like a translation of the word, but the use of that word overcoming touches into this idea of a group of people who are behind or who are being treated secondary, persisting against oppression and coming up from behind to turn the scales and have that sort of revolutionary potential, almost because you are coming from behind. Just to show you in Julia's chart, before I explain how to figure out which planet is overcoming the other, I just want to show you an image of what I'm talking about and sort of say, I'm not going to focus on every planet, but Saturn is overcoming Mercury and Venus by square. Venus and Mercury are overcoming Jupiter, also by square. And then Jupiter is overcoming Saturn by opposition. Okay. And so in order to figure this out, like I said, we're trying to figure out which planet is coming up on the other one from behind. But of course, we're talking about a circle. So how do you tell which one is coming up from behind in a circle? So this is my trick that is like foolproof way. You're always going to know which planet is overcoming the other. And so we're going to start just with Saturn and Venus. So let's pretend we don't already know. Pretend I didn't just tell you that Saturn overcomes Venus. And so you start with one planet. You want to decide if that is the planet overcoming or not. So we're going to choose Saturn. Next step is you draw a line directly across the chart from that planet. So Saturn is at exactly 3 degrees of Gemini and 15 minutes. So the exact degree, exact minute. Draw a line directly to the opposite part of the chart. So it goes directly over to Sagittarius, 3 minutes and 15 seconds. The line is drawn. Next step, imagine that you are the planet. So from the perspective of the planet, next slide, we are Saturn. I draw teeth on the right side of the line, either in my head or I used to do it physically. So draw some teeth there for us, Amy. Those are the teeth I drew in. To help you visualize it better, I added some real teeth. Can you, next slide. Okay, cool. So you draw the teeth on the right side of the line from the perspective of the planet. And then any of the planets that those teeth are pointing towards, that planet is overcoming them. If it's eating them, it's overcoming them. So you see that Saturn overcomes almost every planet in Julia's chart. The mouth is coming towards all of them, and the one that we were trying to focus in on was Venus specifically. So it's pretty clear visually, I think, that the teeth pointing towards is overcoming. And you could do that with any planet. You do the same process and just ask yourself, are the little pointy teeth I just drew pointing towards that planet? Therefore, it is overcoming that planet. Help me remember. Okay. One last important piece of this. So every time there's an aspect between two planets, one planet overcomes the other. But if the aspect is really close, so if it's within 3 degrees, the aspect, like Venus here at 4 and Saturn at 3 are within a degree, then when that planet is being overcome, it gets to hurl a ray backwards at the other planet. And so just like the initial overcoming, that ray can be something, detrimental that harms the planet that it's throwing it back at. If it's, say, Mars or Saturn or a planet in really rough condition, just, it hurls a ray back and that's damaging. But if it's a positive planet, if it's benefic, if it's helpful, then the ray itself is helpful as well. So now let me actually try to place this in Julia's chart to give a sense of what we do interpretively with this. I would love to have done like 4 more examples to really show you how to practice it with the teeth, but we're going to do one more related to oppositions, which are a little more confusing in a second. So Julia's chart with Saturn overcoming Venus, but Venus hurling her benefic ray backwards. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, I will say this very briefly. This is the only huge change interpretively from ancient to modern interpretations, is that a square or an opposition from a benefic, if it's an overcoming square, is actually a positive thing. It improves the planet. So you might have been a little confused earlier when Amy was like, oh, the opposition from Jupiter really helps if you're in the mindset of squares and oppositions are not helpful. But from benefics, if it's an overcoming square specifically, then, or an overcoming opposition, then it actually helps the chart and helps that planet. Next slide. Okay, so thinking about Saturn, in the first house specifically, the first house in ancient astrology, there's much more emphasis on it as the physical body and as our kind of access point to the cosmos. And so because of that, often when we see Saturn in the first house, we can see people who are ostracized, ridiculed, or othered for their physical appearance, for the way that they hold themselves, and for physical things about them that they can't control. So the example of Julia being rejected from the military for being too tall is such a good example, particularly because Saturn is overcoming Venus. And we have all of these associations with Venus as the kind of idealized feminine. And we know that Julia was not really falling into that role in the 1950s and 60s of the kind of submissive housewife. And she was incredibly tall as well. So the physical aspect of her appearance was the thing that the army rejected her for. Essentially having standards at this time that said, if you're too tall, you're not a woman. You can't be in the military. You can't be in the women's military. You're incredibly tall. And so Julia shoots a ray back. I love the idea of Venus hurling a ray back, which is, forget about the army. She becomes a spy. She goes into intelligence. She uses something that's way more relevant to her mind and how she thinks and doing this kind of research and intelligence work. So it's much better for her. And it also moves her away from another conservative Saturnian presence in her life because her father was an extremely negative figure, very discouraging towards anything that Julia wanted to do that essentially was not being a housewife and getting married. Next slide. He tried to make her marry actually, go one more for a second. He tried to make her marry the heir to the LA Times fortune, which I'm sure sounds awesome to some people, but Julia was very opposed to this kind of pressure to be married and have this normal life. And I love this as again, like a an embodiment of her hurling, of Venus hurling a ray backwards, of a Venus in fall refusing to be a stereotypical Venus, hurling her ray back. And she said, if I had to marry a conservative banker or lawyer, I would have played golf and tennis, and I probably would have been an alcoholic. I didn't do my Julia voice, but and so I really see it as almost like every time Saturn places a restriction, tells her that she doesn't belong somewhere because of something about her. She takes that and turns it into something that really draws her towards her calling and makes her more fulfilled on a deeper level. Um, and so other than just Venus hurling a ray, because yes, that is powerful, but I really think that Jupiter overcoming Saturn is the kind of turning point, the main thing that enables Saturn to have benefits rather than just dragging down the chart. So I'm going to show you really briefly one more example of how to identify overcoming because it's more confusing with oppositions. So next slide. Okay, so we're going to now take it from the perspective of Jupiter instead of Saturn. So if we are Jupiter at 5 degrees and 50 seconds of Sagittarius, we draw a line directly to the other side, Gemini, 5 degrees and 50 seconds. Then we draw the teeth on the right side of the line from the perspective of Jupiter. It's important you think about which planet you're doing it from the perspective of. So from Jupiter's perspective, teeth on the right, next slide, and he eats Saturn, even though, you know, it's like easier to see one next slide without the teeth there. But Saturn is above that line. So from to the right of that line from Jupiter's perspective, Jupiter is overcoming Saturn, even by opposition. So the trick doesn't change at all for any aspects. Do exactly the same for all aspects. Next slide. And so this is where I got my title slide from, which is that Saturn generally, Saturn is a Titan, is not an Olympian. And so Saturn represents the old gods and the old order. And I love that there's this reenactment of the myth in Julia's chart, because in Greek myth, we know that that Kronos is overcome by Zeus. All of the Olympians, but Zeus as the leader of the Olympians in the Titanomachy overthrows Saturn. And in Julia's chart, Jupiter overcomes Saturn, that it's in the language and in the chart itself. And so, yeah, I think that it sort of represents various ways that not just with her father, not just at home, but in the industry, you know, she was not taken seriously because of being a woman, but also sort of not considered to be performing femininity and womanhood correctly. So there's this dual kind of patriarchy that she was running up against. And regardless of that, her own Jupiterian energy was certainly part of what overcame people's resistance to her, which is another way we use the word overcoming a lot. Like, I overcame his suspicion of me or his resistance to me. And that was what she was able to do personally with her charisma, with her belief that just it was going to happen. The book would happen. This very Jupiterian sort of confidence and optimism. But next slide. I also want to touch really, really briefly on the fact that her husband was like, it's seventh house Jupiter. It's Jupiter in the seventh. And I think we think a lot in Hellenistic astrology or ancient astrology about the houses and the planets in houses as representations of real people in the external world. So not just, like I'm saying, a representation of Julia's internal Jupiter, but also a person in her life. And so her partner, Paul, ended up, you can go to the next slide, ended up really giving up his career and his professional life to support hers. And they became partners, not just like in love and life, but in business, but in a way that was all about her, And so just as Venus is overcoming Jupiter here, but they're so close that Jupiter can throw a ray back. And so I just wanted to give this as one example of a situation where both overcoming and hurling a ray is beneficial. It's both Venus and it's Venus and Jupiter. It's both of the benefics who are together. Venus is overcoming Jupiter. Paul is there under a desk holding up cue cards for Julia and before she's famous. But Jupiter hurls a ray back. Jupiter wants to be overcome. Jupiter hurls his ray back. And I really think of that as almost like the glance of recognition that you get when you've done something for somebody. So, Julia, for how much of their life supported him, and then his glance of recognition, his remuneration, really, for what she's done for him, I see so much as the kind of poetics of hurling a positive ray back. I think that that was all I wanted to say. I'm teaching a course called Telling the Houses that I think is going to be a really unique course because it's a combination of creative writing and technical astrology. So really learning about the techniques of delineation and the specifics of the ancient approach to the houses, but then using those to go into creative writing and for creative writing itself to be the kind of metaphysical tool that we're using to dig into it. And so the goal is for it not to be like you can have never written anything in your life and you can take this course. It's really more about writing as a metaphysical tool. And I think it will both like help us get out of the kind of pressures of creating something and being artistic and be a really intuitive way for people to touch into the meaning of the houses and delineation. So thank you. Nadia's up. Oh, you can skip these. They're done. We're done.
Hi everyone. Happy Astrology Day. Happy Venus Kazemi. Amy and Joey, I want to thank you both so much for the natal analysis and the foundation that you've laid in understanding Julia's chart so far. I want to now keep building on this analysis by bringing in an ancient Hellenistic Time Lord technique called circumambulations through the bounds. Next slide. And I want to use this technique to start to look at when different planetary time lords are activated in Julia's life so that we can also start to get a sense of when all of those natal themes from the planet are also going to be activated in her life. Because, we've talked so far about Julia's chart as a blueprint for her whole life, but not everything will be active at every moment. So this technique can be incredibly powerful for us in understanding what planetary themes are really going to be prominent at a specific time. And specifically in Julia's chart, I want to look at what planetary time lords helped to fuel her career development from a military spy to eventually becoming a celebrity chef. So next slide. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background into the technique that we're going to be using. Circumambulations through the bounds is an ancient Hellenistic Time Lord technique. You might hear it referred to as distributions or primary directions. And the word circumambulate literally means to walk around. And that's describing what this technique is doing and how it's working. It's moving around the chart, activating different Time Lords along the way. So we start with this technique by identifying a starting point, which we call the releaser. In Julia's chart today, we're going to use the ascendant as the releaser, and I've highlighted that in red. So how this looks now, if we go to the next slide, as we start to move the releaser around the chart at roughly 1 degree a year, that moving point is called the distribution. And you can see this red line, the distribution, moving through different sections of bounds. And I've highlighted those bounds in blue. So we are literally circumambulating through the bounds right now. And as the distribution is in a specific bound, it's activating that bound lord, and that will be our time lord during that period. So next slide. So for an example here, we can see the distribution, the red line, is just moving into Cancer to Julia's second house. This is like around the time that she is 25 years old. And so it's moving into the first bounds of Mars. So Mars is going to be our Time Lord during this period. And from an interpretive perspective, what that means is that Mars themes will be very prominent in Julia's life. Both natural significations of Mars as well as all of the natal significations of Mars in Virgo in her fourth house. And I really like to think about this technique as then being able to give us a table of contents for the life of an individual. So each of these different primary Time Lord periods is then going to act as its own unique chapter in that life and bring its own distinct themes and tone into that chapter of the life. Next slide. So turning to Julia's Time Lord periods, you can see this column on the left. These are all of her Time Lords from the age of roughly 25 to the age of roughly 65. So really the peak of her career development. And you'll notice that each of these Time Lords is ruling for a pretty long stretch of time. It's, I think, 8 years on average. And that means that each of these planets has a very long runway to get all of its natal agenda and natal themes off of the ground. And I think that's one of the reasons that this technique can be so powerful, because it helps us to understand these prolonged periods of planetary influence that an individual will be experiencing. So right now, I want to take you through each of these Time Lord periods. I'm not going to go super deep into any of them, but I more want to create kind of a survey of each of these different periods so that you can get a sense of the distinct qualities and themes and tone that come out during each of them. So we will start with Julia's Mars period. Next slide. So leading up to this time, Julia had just graduated from college and she moved to New York, and she was pursuing a dream of becoming a writer. And then when Mars became her primary Time Lord, a series of abrupt shifts happened in her life. Her mother became ill, and Julia decided to move home to California, leaving New York behind to take care of her. And then within a year, her mother died. This kind of developed into another conflict with her father that Joey already mentioned, where her father's tried to start this pressure campaign to get her to marry, settle down, adopt a lifestyle that she was very opposed to. And so if we look at Mars in her birth chart, we see that Mars is in her fourth house, in this house of home and family. And Mars as a planet has significations of conflict, aggression, illness. And so as soon as Mars becomes her Time Lord during this period, all of these themes start to dominate her life. She has to leave her home in New York. Her mother dies. She has this really prolonged conflict with her father. So how she then reacts to this also is very Mars inspired. Julia decides to strategically rebel, which is two more Mars qualities. She moves to Washington, D.C. She joins the war effort and the military intelligence agency, the OSS, and she becomes a top secret researcher. So we basically see Julia extricates herself from her conflict with her father during this period, but the Mars themes continue in the form of war involvement and military intelligence. Then in 1944, Mars hands over to Venus as primary Time Lord. And a few months before this, Julia was restationed overseas in Ceylon, India. And so this is a really great example of one Time Lord handing over to another Time Lord, and that corresponding with a distinct shift in the circumstances of the individual at that time. And so in Ceylon, Julia meets Paul Child within a month. Paul is the love of her life. And so her entire reality shifts into something much more Venusian. They fall in love. They eventually get married. They move to Paris together. She falls in love there with French cooking, and she enrolls in the Cordon Bleu. I will really quickly say Joey also highlighted just sort of some of the challenges of her Venus. And, Venus is also in fall in her chart and receiving an overcoming score from Saturn. And so a lot of these, very positive experiences, very benefic Venusian experiences in her life, also did come with challenges. Her and Paul got off to a rocky start in their relationship. She had to kind of convince him to marry her, which is really much like this Venus in fall, being humbled and trying to like convince the person you love to agree with you. And then, most literally, the day before their wedding, they got in a car accident. So, their wedding, all of the pictures of them, they are like bandaged, their heads are bandaged. It's like literally this Venus in fall, but yet, you know, ultimately, it was a very happy marriage. And Julia would write about this period of her life later and say that she felt herself unfolding like a flower during this period. And so I think this is a really great testimonial to the fact that for Julia, for her lived experience of this Venus Time Lord period, it was incredibly Venusian. And then in 1951, Mercury became her Time Lord. And Amy already talked a lot about the incredible condition that Mercury is in her natal chart. Mercury rules themes of writing, intelligence, practical wisdom. And Amy also spoke about how supported she was in writing a cookbook with this incredibly strong Mercury. So it's really not a surprise that it is as soon as Mercury is activated that she decides to take on this project and write this cookbook. And she actually spends the entirety of this Mercury period writing the cookbook. And by the end of this period, she had over 800 pages, and she presented it to her publisher, they had a contract and everything, and they were horrified because they hadn't expected 800 pages. They had in mind that their audience was not interested in something so detail oriented. And, you know, ultimately they would drop the whole project. And so Amy also spoke, and Joey spoke about how Mercury has some challenges too. Mercury is retrograde and receiving the same overcoming score from Saturn. So we see also during this period this theme of, slowness with the endeavor. It takes 7 years to write this project. The publisher requires all these revisions and then rejects it. And so then in 1958, Julia enters into her Jupiter Time Lord period. She's 46 years old. She's breaking up with her publisher and really trying to get this like decade-long work out into the world. And so Jupiter, being this planet of luck, expansion, abundance, also being very dignified and strong in her seventh house of partnerships, really just suddenly changes everything. She has this huge wave of opportunity and career success. So she finds a new publisher within a year who's a huge champion of the work. Mastering the Art of French Cooking is published. It is an instant success. It's a bestseller. And then this series of very left field events happen. And Julia then has the opportunity to create a cooking show based on this cookbook called The French Chef. And The French Chef, which she didn't want to do, she wasn't trying to do this. This was not a genre of television that even existed. But it happens, and it's an instant success. By the end of her Jupiter period, she has received a Peabody Award for the show. She received an Emmy for the show, which was again unheard of. And beyond the shadow of a doubt, this Jupiter period is the most successful career period of her life. It's like a huge break for her. And then in 1966, Jupiter hands over to Saturn as Time Lord. And a few weeks before Saturn became Time Lord, the last episode of season 5 of The French Chef aired. Then, as soon as Saturn becomes her Time Lord, all production of The French Chef is put on pause. And so we know that Saturn is this planet that signifies, constrictions, limitations, slowness. And so that instantly seems to have an effect on her television show. Also, Amy and Joey both talked about Saturn in Julia's first house, potentially signifying health challenges. And during this period, Julia is diagnosed with breast cancer and she had a radical mastectomy. So she spent a lot of this period recovering from that, both physically and emotionally. She put her television career on hold and she stayed out of the public eye. Then in 1971, Jupiter again becomes her Time Lord. And this is the craziest example of everything that I'm going to share, in my opinion. So as soon as Jupiter again becomes her Time Lord, season 6 of The French Chef airs. So we have this television show that really launches her into fame during her first Jupiter Time Lord period. It goes on pause the entire duration of her Saturn period, and then it resumes once Jupiter again becomes her Time Lord. And so production continues. Season 7 airs, season 8 airs. She has other projects that are also immensely successful. And this second Jupiter period really represents a second wave of career success for her. Next slide. So those are this was a sprint, but I think like even just flipping through these chapters of her life, you can see how each of her Time Lords really brought its natal themes into prominence during its period of rulership. And hopefully you can see what an amazing technique this can be for helping us to understand periods of potential challenge in someone's life and also windows of opportunity that they have. And I will be teaching a course on this technique at Kepler starting in May. We'll be going deeper into the foundations for practicing this technique, interpretive principles, a lot of case studies. We'll be looking at software resources to use. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I would love to see anyone who's interested there. And I am now going to hand over.
So happy Astrology Day, everyone. My name is Brian Forman, and I'm honored to be here in this panel presentation. My contribution to our panel presentation is called From Rejection to Recognition, and I'll be exploring planetary condition, profections, and astrological consultation in the life of Julia Child. So as Amy mentioned, Hellenistic chart analysis begins by assessing the condition of each planet to determine a planet's effectiveness in bringing forth its significations in an individual's life. And as Amy mentioned, this analysis involves examining sect, houses, and aspects. And while there have been some criticisms for the Hellenistic approach being deterministic, recognizing the strengths and challenges within a person's chart and life can be a pathway to healing. And so this framework of chart analysis provides space and room for the entirety of the human experience. So Julia Child's life exemplifies the blend of ups and downs. And the Hellenistic framework can be a valuable tool for interpreting your own chart and also understanding your life. And if you're working with clients, friends, family, this framework provides meaningful starting points for discussions and investigations about challenges. So once we've established how a planet will manifest in the life, the question, as Nadia started to explore, is when. And Nadia discussed the technique of circumambulations, which describes broader periods of time. But there's another Time Lord technique called annual perfections, which allows us to focus on a specific year in the life. So from the moment of birth, the first house is activated. The first house, or the ascendant, representing life itself and is the most personal part of the chart. And each birthday, the next house in zodiacal order becomes active. So between the ages of 0 and 1, the first house is activated. between 1 and 2, the second house, and so on. And this graphic displays the ages at which houses become activated. So when a house is activated through this technique, any planets in that house are spotlighted, but we also look to the ruler of the house for deeper insights about the experiences likely to manifest during a given year. And this is a useful technique to consider if you're preparing for a consultation, to have an idea of what types of themes a person might be navigating over the course of a year. So to illustrate how this technique works, let's focus on 2 consecutive years in Julia's life. When she turned 47, her 12th house was active, and she didn't have any planets in her 12th house, so we look to the ruler Venus, which is positioned in the 4th. So she enters a Venus-ruled year on August 15th, 1959, until the following birthday. And Venus is in fallen Virgo. As Demetra George writes in her book, Ancient Astrology, Volume 1, when a planet occupies the sign opposite its exaltation sign, it's considered to be in a state of depression or fall. And so this term encompasses both a lower status, being humbled or seen as low-born, and a corresponding state of melancholy or downcast spirits. So while other factors such as sect, aspects, and house placement will influence how a planet manifests, Venus's sign placement suggests that Julia might face less favorable outcomes this year. And indeed, a few months into her Venus-ruled year, on November 6, 1959, Julia received a rejection letter from her publisher. She had received a $250 advance years before, promise of publication, and dedicated many years to her cookbook, but she found herself back at square one after the rejection. So planets in fall can represent areas of life where one may feel out of place or overlooked. And these themes were highlighted during this given year. Now, the following year, next slide, please. Julia turns 48 and her first house is activated. So her Time Lord becomes Mercury. Amy spoke to the condition of Mercury in Julia's chart. And during this Mercury ruled year, when Mercury takes over, we go from Julia's year being ruled by Venus, a planet in fall, to Mercury in Virgo, where it is both in rulership and exaltation. And a planet in rulership is about stability, resources, and exaltation can be about respect. So Mercury, being in the sign of its exaltation, enjoys esteem, respect, and honor. And Demetra George writes in Ancient Astrology, Volume 1, the power and influence that individuals have with an exalted planet is due partially to the authority or status of its higher position, and partially to the respect and esteem in which others hold them. So Julia's writing, which is representative of her mercurial work, became elevated, esteemed, and recognized. And her publisher, or another publisher who picked up the manuscript after the initial rejection, said, reading and studying this book seems just like taking a class at Cordon Bleu, and I recommend that the book be published. Mastering the Art of French Cooking was published a year later. So understanding planetary condition is a powerful tool for healing and can inform our approach in consultations. Examining the condition of a planet when activated through various timing techniques gives us clues about the kinds of questions we might encourage ourselves or our clients to explore in order to find meaning and insight. So an exalted planet can indicate aspects of your life that are elevated and held in high regard. And they also can signify people who uplift you or areas where you have significant influence. Planets in rulership can indicate gifts, talents, or resources to share. So as astrologers, part of our work is to hold space for clients by acknowledging their struggles and disappointments while encouraging them to cultivate resilience. And we can look to other parts of the chart for support or mitigation as opportunities for growth. Now, if Julia sought consultation, we might encourage her as a client or our clients to work with the people, themes, or topics that are represented by their challenged planets. In Julia's chart, Venus in fall represents the women in her country as it is positioned in the 4th house. And during Julia's time, the patriarchal worldview prevented women from being in cooking school. Women experienced discrimination in cooking schools and often believed they couldn't make a career in food. And Julia's success really opened new career paths and possibilities for women and expanded the range of opportunities available to them. Julia was also a strong advocate for women's rights and believed in the importance of women having the freedom to determine their own lives. She supported organizations like Planned Parenthood, and she was very pro-choice. So despite facing setbacks, failures, and disappointments as indicated by Venus in her chart, Julia leveraged her status, resources, and esteem to uplift women, advocate for marginalized individuals, and generously supported young chefs. So in conclusion, the analysis of planetary condition in a client's chart can reveal significant areas for exploration and growth. In Julia's case, the contrasting experiences of her Venus-ruled year, where she faced challenges and disappointments, and the following year, which was ruled by Mercury, offered a more promising environment for expression and achievement. And this can really highlight how planetary placements inform the variety of experiences throughout life. So this is a way that we can guide clients to navigate their unique challenges with empathy and insight, and really allows for deeper conversations about resilience and adaptability. And it emphasizes that even during difficult periods like the one indicated by Venus, that there are opportunities for empowerment, resilience, and sometimes even advocacy. And I like this quote to end. Cooking is one failure after another, and that is how you finally learn. I think it really speaks to Julia's ability to uplift others and also the empower. She was such a champion for empowering people to experiment and learn in the kitchen. Thank you.
I kept forgetting Brian isn't here during that. I was like listening and being like, oh, Brian. Wait, there is no Brian.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy, Joey, Nadia, and Brian. And if you see this, Brian, on the replay, thank you so much for submitting the video. Absolutely insightful, brilliant presentations. Thank you all so much. And we do have a question or two if you guys are ready. So let's have a quick look. One question we've got here is, what if a planet is in aversion to its ruler, but the ruler is in its domicile? For example, Moon in Taurus with Venus in Libra, or Moon in Aries with Mars in Scorpio.
I think that it can speak to, like, one thing that I learned a lot is, like, just because one condition is good and one condition is more challenging, they don't balance each other out. It demonstrates that there will be challenges and there will also be benefits. And so when a planet is in its own domicile, it has support on its own agenda, but when it's in aversion, it might not be able to see the resources. And I'm also taking Dr. Ben Dykes' class on traditional natal astrology, and he talks about how those are that the aversions are like shadows, and so that there can be like a shadow quality or a lack of awareness to the planet getting the resources that it needs, but that planet who is in domicile is strong in its ability to like capture the resources in order to operate. So that's my take on it. I don't know if Joey or Nadia would add anything to that.
Wonderful. I will ask these questions, and thank you for all the presenters. You're answering the questions in the Q&A, but this might be useful for everybody listening here as well. So one of the questions was, does overcoming have more impact, or is it more... Oh, I've lost it now. Does overcoming have more impact, or is it more powerful if the aspect is a trine, or which aspect is more important? And Joey, would you like to expand on the answer you gave?
Yeah, absolutely. That it's not that one aspect is more powerful than another aspect. It's that when whichever planet is overcoming, it is like a an exaggeration of their energy, and the aspect itself is important to that. So an overcoming trine from benefics is the best case scenario. An overcoming square or opposition from malefics is the worst case scenario. So every single aspect, one of them is overcoming and the other one isn't. And it's that more of that amplification of both the aspect itself and the planet, depending on which one is overcoming. I have an image that I'm trying to put in the chat box. Should I put it in the Q&A or in the chat that shows this?
Maybe, yeah, either or. Maybe the chat box. I think most people are in there.
Yeah, I'll
That's
just stick it
perfect.
in the chat box. But essentially, like, the best case scenario is called bonification. The worst case scenario is called maltreatment. So I'll just put an image that shows you what the conditions are for those two best and worst case scenarios.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joey. I do love that background. And thank you, Nadia. You answered this question, but I hope if you can expand on this question, is there a specific criteria for identifying the releaser?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And to be honest, it's a complicated answer, partly because many Hellenistic and medieval astrologers had their own point of view on this. So everyone kind of brings a different idea to the table. But one point of view for looking for the releaser is that you're looking for the most vital point in the birth chart. And so the planets and points that you would be considering would be the sun or the moon, and specifically first, whichever is the sect light of the chart, the lot of fortune, the ascendant, and some people also say the prenatal lunation. And you feed each of these potential releasers through a whole bunch of criteria, like are they being aspected by their bound lord or a lord? Again, it comes down to you're just trying to assess which is the most vital of those points. Because this became so complicated, there's also a part of the tradition later that just defaults to the ascendant because it is a more straightforward option. And then the final thing that I would say is that also many astrologers, including Ptolemy, really advocated for releasing from every planet and point, depending on what topic you were looking into. Is that helpful?
Well, thank you so much for expanding on those questions. Absolutely wonderful. Again, thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. And of course, we put the links in the chat box for all of the fantastic classes you'll all be teaching at Kepler College. And I will move on to the next presentation. So let me just share the slide here. I don't know if you can see all the hearts and the claps coming through. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Callum, there's actually one more question if you want to.
Oh, there is? Okay. My apologies. Oh, yes, there is. Thank you, Laurie. Which bounds do you use in this sample? I'm not sure which. Was that to Brian's presentation?
No, I think it's to Nadia's.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry, the question is which bounds are we using?
I think so. Yep.
Yes.
The Egyptian bounds.
Egyptian. Okay. Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you for all of your questions. And let me share the screen share here.